Hello and welcome back to Colonial Outcast, the anti-imperialist podcast that's been around for almost 11 months, definitely trying to get to 50,000 subscribers by the anniversary in February, since humans have a fixation with certain numerical increments. Share, subscribe. If you're picking up what we're putting down, we're talking about Syria today, so you might not be, but we're just glad you're here. We're joined again after 2 weeks by Alina Xenofontos, geopolitical analyst, coming to us now, this time from foggy London town. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Very accurate description. Foggy London town, indeed.
It's the winter. Do you have snow yet?
No. But let's be honest about it. It's London. It's kind of foggy most of the time. But,
Yeah.
At least now there's an excuse this winter.
Yeah. So, okay, first of all, to our patrons, I'm sorry we missed the live Q&A and our comedic episode last Friday. We're going to do 2 of those this week. Starting with tonight, we're going to be talking about all the insane conspiracy theories going around about the New Jersey drones shutting down Air Force bases and stuff. Apparently there's like a dirty bomb that's been snuck in through a New Jersey port, and it's aliens too. So should be interesting. So stick around for that one tonight. But we are talking about Syria. And it's kind of like my fault that we neglected the Patreon. Last week, we did 2 episodes on Syria with guests who had varying takes on the fall of Assad. Both are journalists with a lot of experience who I do respect. One had a more liberation-based, hopeful take, which I will always platform, but I don't really see how it happens. And one last Thursday with Robert Inlakesh, a journalist from Mint Press with a ton of contacts and experience in the region. And we kind of went through all the players in Syria, the Arab states who don't want the new Syrian revolution, if you want to call it that, to succeed because they don't want their own people looking at it and taking inspiration or getting any funny ideas, even though they're probably not that concerned because it's already getting balkanized. And we also talked about how the HTS political body is more moderate now. They're still probably going to have morality police and some implementation of Sharia law, but they are trying to court Western and Arab League support. But will they be able to control their extremist foreign fighters, etc.? Is still going to be a thing going on, and that's gonna, I don't know. No one knows. But anyways, I knew this would fracture the pro-Palestine movement, which it has, but the damage is reversible. And it was always going to happen, I guess, because I talked about HTS and Al-Jolani in a way that some people didn't like, saying that he'll likely be more moderate, being a political animal, like literally styling himself physically even as Zelensky 2.0, doing a media campaign with CNN, meeting with the UN envoy today, even though he is a designated terrorist under the UN and has a $10 million bounty. This whole entire situation is crazy. Also, the US, I talked about doing strikes in Syria that were against ISIS, like actually against ISIS, which they were. Not everything US Central Command says is a lie. And we also talked about this regime change looks way more like an unforeseen and exploited opportunity than a meticulously crafted Western Turkish Israeli plot, even though those are players that are factor into that. And that people had legit and absurdly legit grievances against Assad and his government. Did we forget about barrel bombs? And it's not all CIA propaganda. And that narrative is also reductive, disempowering to Syrian people, and frankly, exhausting. But anyways, basically, what was going on with me this whole time, if anyone's interested, was, I get death threats still from Zionists and Nazis and white nationalists, and get made fun of on a lot of right-wing channels. And I could care less, but getting called simultaneously an Al-Qaeda supporter and an Assadist at the same time from in the movement, really effed with me. And then I got started thinking about my own experiences, actually engaging Salafi jihadists in my 20s, and kind of spiraled out, thinking about how we sacrificed our youth and buried our friends for imperialism, fighting organizations and individuals that the CIA originally propped up, then lost control of. How much I despise imperialism. And looking at this Syria situation, imperialism won in a very unexpected way. And I handled that kind of inescapable fact very dysfunctionally. And anyways, I'm over it. It's time to get back to work. By the way, the CIA doesn't necessarily control Al Qaeda or ISIS. They're able to influence and sometimes hire former operatives and leaders. We're seeing that play out now, and definitely in Yemen. They're one of the main opposition forces. Former Al Qaeda are a big opposition force to the Houthis. They will also strike Islamic State targets, which we are seeing now in Syria, in order to contain them. But just look, we'll never see them wiped out completely. All right. We always need that threat hanging in the air like background radiation. So just wanted to make a few points before going into this. No one's going to be happy when it comes to how you cover this, but we're just going to talk about how we see this thing playing out on the ground and in the future, and we'll see who is right and who is not. So anyways, let's get into it. Again, Alina, thanks for coming on. I guess the intense emotions swirling around are a mixture of elation that Assad is deposed and the axis of resistance in the state of the Palestinian cause look to be in a pretty bleak state right now. So things looked like they were going well in terms of the Israeli state destroying itself, basically boiling itself a lot, like boiling the frog, as the Cradle media kind of coined the term. And things looked like they were going well. The U.S. was losing massive influence in the region. And then within a week, pretty much more like 2 weeks, all this pressure that was building got released. And the entire situation has taken a 180. Literally, the empire strikes back, which, happens before the fall. Are there any generalized comments on that you would have about that, like the new geopolitical reality?
Well, I'll start by saying back in July, I think it was, we did a podcast together. And I think it was in July. And I had actually mentioned in that particular podcast an alarming piece of news that was coming out, particularly the Cradle media had reported on it quite well, with regards to the SDF, which is like a Western backed, like obviously the Kurdish movement in Syria, that was essentially releasing a couple of thousands ISIS affiliates and fighters back into Syria under the condition that if they are to act again, they wouldn't in any way jeopardize or attack members or affiliates with the SDF. And I remember stating at that particular point in time that I found this to be rather concerning, because what we were seeing was that it was at the point in time where there was a lot of speculation as to whether Israel was actually going to target or invade Lebanon. And we had all agreed that Lebanon, rather Hezbollah, was very military equipped, or far superior military equipped, to actually deal with any sort of possible invasion on behalf of Israel, and that Israel didn't lack the military capacity, the economic capacity, and in any way to actually combat Hezbollah as in face to face. And we actually saw that play out when they finally did actually enter Lebanon, which they weren't even really fully able to do, but they did inflict a lot of damage and harm on the Lebanese people, on the south, and specifically on Hezbollah. And I remember at that particular time stating that the axis of resistance is the greatest sort of opposition to imperialism in the region. Because, I mean, whether it's in Iraq, whether it's in Syria, whether it's Lebanon, and then obviously Palestine and Yemen, these are the factions right now that are pushing against imperialism in the region. They're the only factions that are pushing against imperialism in the region. And if you, as like the Western powers who are, I mean, as a result of the crisis of capitalism, they are trying to sustain their power in the region, they need to eliminate the axis of resistance. And I had said, given that Hezbollah was the vanguard of the axis of resistance, they would be the first target. And that's essentially what happened. However, and I remember having this conversation, Israel doesn't have the ability on its own. And then what we had sort of come to, and what you had said is like, well, you can't, the United States is not going to have foots on the ground to actually be able to help them. And I concluded by saying, well, they don't need to. There's a lot of these so-called, like, these rebel fighters in Syria who are ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Al-Nusra affiliated. These are dangerous people. These are people that have been trained. There's been billions spent to train them specifically by the Western imperial powers, who are being currently let loose into Syria. And if they mobilize enough, they could be the ones to strike. And Syria was the center and the hub for the axis of resistance. So if Syria fell, this would be a huge blow to the axis of resistance as a whole. And so my general conclusion is what happened in Syria was a combination of, if we look over the course of the Syrian sort of war in the previous decade, The only reason that Syria was able to, I guess, prevent these particular fighters from gaining, making more significant gains was with Russian intervention. The Axis of Resistance, Hezbollah fighters were also involved in combating a lot of these particular militants. So it was Iran, Russia, and the General Axis of Resistance coming together with the Syrian Arab army to sort of somewhat at least create this sort of frozen conflict for a period of time. However, Hezbollah has been distracted in a war for over a year, whether it was low intensity for a while, but then it escalated dramatically in September, where the entire commanding force of Hezbollah was essentially wiped out. Russia is facing another war in Ukraine, essentially battling on its western borders with essentially NATO at this point, and they've got to strategize accordingly. Iran has its own considerations to be taking with regards to possible escalation with the West and Israel. So there was a bit of a loss of focus, in my humble opinion, of what was happening in Syria. This is my personal opinion, of course. And as a result, I think Syria collapsed. That's one of the reasons I think Syria collapsed rather quickly, because of the other ongoing issues, wars that are currently ongoing. And it's all part and parcel of the same sort of greater war that's happening globally. And it's a war of imperialism trying to sustain itself at this particular point. So going back to part of your intro, I don't really believe that this was sort of accidental. I think this was something that was in the making for a long time. And due to the fact that certain actors were distracted, I think it was planned, especially given how many of these fighters were being let loose from 2021 onwards. And we saw an escalation of ISIS fighters being let back into Syria by US-backed SDF forces. So I think they had that in mind. I will say that much.
Yeah, and I don't mean like accidental. I mean, these forces, these players have been existing in the region and have been put in place and funded for a long time. The pieces were already there. What I was saying, I think it was on one of my first Mint Press episode where I did on this, where I was just like looking at the forces of HTS and then the relative military assets of the Syrian Arab army, to include Iraqi, Iranian-backed proxies that could cross over the border like they did in the first iteration of the war, looking at the Russian Air Force, which HTS doesn't have any air power, and looking at the Syrian Arab army. What they first did when they pulled out of Aleppo, looks like, because they demilitarized after the Astana Accords in 2019, or they demobilized, that they were pulling back to more strategic positions, and then they were going to have to like fight to retake Aleppo. No, I don't think anybody thought, maybe one or two people that I've heard, but I think the majority of people, myself included, didn't think that the Syrian Arab army with Russian air power, and Russia having a vested interest in having a military footprint in the region, would fold like a rag doll. And that's exactly what happened. There's a lot of complicated reasons for that, and we probably won't really know for a while. I suspect, and what I've heard from people in Syria was like some of the generals were paid off. Don't really know by whom. But again, that will come out later, and there wasn't like a will to fight. But what I said was, regardless of any foreign backing, if HTS's goal was to depose Assad, they would have no better time to attack than the day after the ceasefire with Hezbollah. That's like their best strategic time to do it. And I don't think that everything I saw, based on the fighters, based off the leadership, based off monitoring the communiques coming out of their operations center in Idlib province, they didn't expect to have this kind of success.
So this is the thing. So there's a lot of speculation as to what happened with Russia as well. This is why I'm avoiding speculating until we have more information, because that's just, I like to go like very fact-based before I make these sort of assertions. But like, I remember, like, even when Netanyahu in the Knesset, when he was announcing the ceasefire, he directly had made significant threats towards Assad at that time. And I had brought it up in the last podcast that we had together. I knew, to be honest, I was expecting that Syria was going to be the next point of, like, the next flashpoint. What shocked me as well, much like everybody else, is just how fast and effective it was. However, I do think that the ceasefire happened in Lebanon specifically because the next point was going to be Syria. If you take down Syria, you isolate the axis, you fracture the axis, and that is going to be far more conducive in defeating Hezbollah in future than leaving Syria sort of to exist. Because I mean, you've had former Mossad and Shin Bet officials on Hebrew media essentially stating, even after the fall of Assad, that they're in connection and they have close ties with HTS leadership, and that they hope. I think I even have the video. I think I posted it as well on my socials, where this member of Shin Bet, I can't remember his name at the moment. He has essentially said, now with the rise of HTS, we will see an Israeli embassy in Damascus, but also in Beirut. HTS will also have an embassy in Beirut. What does this mean? They will start mobilizing and entering the borders into Lebanon. And I had said before, they're going to try to create civil conflict within Lebanon, and it's going from what is supposed to be a regional conflict is now going to become essentially a religious conflict, which is what imperialists love to thrive on, which is internalized dichotomies and sectarianism through sort of like these identity politics, aka using religious identity as a means to divide people within a region. I mean, I come from Cyprus. I know exactly how that one was planned out for us. So I think that I don't think it was just, it was an opportunist moment. This is obviously my angle, I think it was perfectly orchestrated. And my biggest question and what I'm trying to figure out is what happened with regards to the Axis and Russia and Iran and the SAA, and why indeed they folded to the degree that they have. I think this is what's most interesting, but there's not enough information for a conclusive argument.
Yeah, unfortunately not. And plus, there's so many players, and the fog of war is so thick right now. The only thing that I think we could talk about with like some degree of certainty is basically explaining what's going on with Israel right now. So it's my belief, I made this observation from the start, their modus operandi, their way of acting militarily is to send troops in to an exploitable opportunity and figure it out. So they did this in Lebanon. They tried to do it in Lebanon with this completely murkily defined buffer zone. They were going to, push Hezbollah back anywhere from a few kilometers all the way up to the Litani River. And then they were going to have to occupy it as a security force. And they weren't able to do it. However, they are able to do that in Syria, because who's going to say no? HTS has said we're not going to engage in fighting. They don't have any beef with Israel or the United States. In fact, they can only survive politically with Western backing right now, especially in that region. Now, Israel is rolling into or getting nearer and nearer to the suburbs of Damascus, expanding their illegal occupation with the for security concerns. Because the HTS is a bunch of radical Islamists, but then again, they're normalizing with them, but they still need to expand. So it's all BS. We've seen from the beginning of this quote unquote conflict that it's basically just opportunity to expand a project of a greater Israel. Because again, the Likud party came up with the term from the river to the sea. Their entire ideology is based off ethnic cleansing and occupation. And so Israel's calculus in Syria is to exploit chaos and a vacuum of military power for strategic dominance. They have destroyed most of the Syrian Arab army's military infrastructure, their aircraft, their helicopters, their heavy weapons platforms, their artillery systems, their tanks, their ordnance. Like, this looks like they blew up a massive ordnance depot last night. This is from an Israeli airstrike. Look at that. And apparently, according to this was in the Syrian city of it was reported to have a 0.3 magnitude earthquake, on nearby seismic sensors. So they're going to have no actual way to resist any occupation, because all HTS has is small arms and Toyota Hiluxes. That's it. And even still, they won't resist. So basically, the destruction of Syria's military infrastructure, Tel Aviv hopes to either expand its borders into a newly partitioned, because that's the word now, partitioned Syria, or to use its gains as negotiating chips in a grand bargain for regional primacy.
All right. So there's multiple things here. All right. So the first thing I was going to say is this is why I'm personally believe this was completely a strategic move in conjunction with these fighters, these rebel fighters, with essentially Israel, Turkey, and pretty much like the Western powers as a whole. I just want to make one little parenthesis before I get into that, and I will explain Israel's position in this. But I mean, when you have reports coming out, like I said, of, from CSIS, which is like, Western think tank and one of the most prominent in the world, publishing reports effectively stating that even 4.4 trillion being spent by the US on Iraq and Syria in the last 20 years, and obviously in Syria would be the last 10, 14 years, with 1.9 being, or 2.3 rather, being attributed to Iraq and the remainder being given to aid Syrian rebellion. These people that are so-called Syrian rebels, of which the vast majority of them are actually foreign fighters, based on the statistics proven by the SOHR, which I can get to at a later point, these individuals are compromised. And when they come to power and they overthrow Assad, and they've overthrown Assad, and their main position, particularly Jolani, has come out instead of Sky News, etc. Our main position was to overthrow Assad and also eliminate, essentially, like go after like Hezbollah in Iran, and okay, what he's basically in the axis of resistance. That perfectly coincidentally happens to align with Israel's position at the perfect time for Israel. And when you consider as well what some of these agents of Israel have also stated recently on their media outlets, that they're in discussions with and they're cooperating with HTS, I think that it becomes very clear, because now what's happened with regards to Israel's expansion. Netanyahu has come out and effectively openly stated proudly that the fall of Assad wouldn't have happened without Israel. This is his statement. So he was very open about it in his speech. He then goes on to state that the Golan Heights is now a closed matter. It will belong firmly within the scope of Israel, which up until this point was up for contestation under international legal law, right? It was. But now, because of this particular what's happened, Israel has basically said, well, we've taken that. And the new, I guess, like HTS, which is sort of like the name out, like for Syria, has essentially said, well, we're not going to deal with that. So giving away the Golan Heights.
While still condemning it, they're like, this is a violation.
Oh, but the condemnation doesn't do anything.
Yeah, Syrian sovereignty must be respected. But they've already said they seek.
But they've also gone up to. This is the thing. Is what I want to say. But they've also allowed them to get up to the Mount Hermon. Now, this is very geostrategically important. Not only has this secured Israel's control of Golan Heights, but the HTS has also allowed them to basically colonize or occupy at this point one of the most geostrategic locations in Western Asia, which is Mount Hermon, which is only second to Lebanon's like mountainous areas. It's one of its peak. And you have these Israeli military officials saying you cannot beat heights when it comes to essentially surveillance and control over the entire region. What this essentially means, it will become even more difficult now for any actual resistance factions throughout the region, whether you're in Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Palestine, to be able to mobilize, because they're going to be under the control, because they'll be so surveillance and controlled by Mount Hermon, which is now being essentially occupied by Israel. And we got a whole CNN piece that was published essentially stating the significance of this for Israel. I mean, they're almost glorifying and normalizing that it's okay for Israel to just take this territory. And HTS, we're now trying to, I guess, they're trying to be this rebrand of HTS, which we did see in the past in the 80s as well. I think people should look up some of the material that was coming out of Western mainstream media glorifying Osama bin Laden as a revolutionary force that expelled the Soviets. We're sort of seeing the same narrative play out now until they no longer serve their purpose. And then eventually because when you have a faction of radicals, because at the end of the day, even if it's not Jolani himself, we're talking about tens of thousands of these fighters who have been to a certain extent radicalized, that you won't be able to control. And I agree with you in that you will eventually lose control of them. they're also going to become the pretext for further U.S. sort of and Western sort of intervention in the region. We're already seeing that as well play out in Iraq, when Iraq has now for the last 2 years, 3 years actually, 4 years, been systematically requesting for the removal of American bases. And the U.S. has constantly stated, well, ISIS is a threat, even though it was no longer a threat. But now, again, those fears have been reignited. And that's the irony here. You've got like Israel and the U.S. effectively saying, well, we can't control, we have trying to say, well, HTS or normalize, etc., even though these individuals have former ties and have worked with Al-Qaeda and ISIS. But they're trying to take HTS off a terrorist list, but then they're also stating we need to actually invade, and like, especially Israel is claiming that they're bombing Syria senseless. They're destroying all its military and defense infrastructure. Yeah. And it's to prevent it getting to the wrong hands.
Right. But, this whole courting of extremists is basically part and parcel of U.S. foreign policy because, as I said in my intro, they will bomb ISIS. They will send U.S. Special Operations Forces into Syria to kill ISIS leadership, but they will never get rid of it completely. No. Operation Inherent Resolve has been going on forever, 10 years. And of course they said, oh, we can't go in, we can no longer hit ISIS targets in Syria because, the Astana Agreement and, Syrian sovereignty, you can't bomb sovereign nations, et cetera, bullshit. But they'll never get rid of them. So it definitely serves the purpose of keeping it in a state of like basically controlled chaos. What happened back in 2011 during the Syrian civil war was way more chaos than the U.S. wanted. But we have a bad history of creating Frankenstein monsters and being like, we need to control this. So they're going to try to contain the extremist elements, but also they're totally fine with them disrupting the country.
Yeah, because that allows, chaos is where they thrive. Like if you have a disrupted Syria to the degree, which is what's going to be happening now with all these fractions and all these radicals, it's easy to exploit. And Israel, of course, who has participated and openly said that they've been participating in aiding different Islamic and jihadist extremists since pretty much the inauguration of the Syrian civil war. This is therefore, this is why they have a lead, like they have said that they have somewhat good relations with some of these members today, because they've obviously collaborated and worked with one another in the past. So now you have chunks of Syria being taken by Israel and their ambitions for greater Israel, which is essentially just constantly expansionism. They've taken strategic locations in Israel and then, in Syria, and fractured the axis of resistance completely. They're going to isolate Hezbollah in Lebanon. Based on their own sort of discussions on Hebrew media, they basically bombed the infrastructure of Syria, which is illegal to do, because at the end of the day, Assad is gone, but that does not give you the right to destroy all the military infrastructure, which means that Syria no longer will ever have the capability to defend itself. It's become a defenseless state.
Yeah, and even with the hypothetical that this government
belongs to Syria.
Yeah, but even in a hypothetical, for argument's sake, that this HTS government or whatever transitional government the UN Special Envoy just went down to facilitate actually succeeds, whatever that looks like, it would take decades to rebuild that military capacity. So
exactly.
Yeah. So, and what was interesting about this is that, Israel's actions were met with like muted responses on the global stage. Arab states, as you mentioned earlier, issued like routine condemnations that carried little weight, raising suspicion of like tacit approval or alignment with Israel's normalization agenda, even if that was not their intent. So I'm not making any suppositions there, but Saudi Arabia and like the UAE and Qatar like strongly condemned that like this would ruin Syria's chances of restoring security, which is true. But they said like this would hurt the normalization process. I doubt that seriously, but Western responses were interesting because National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan framed Israel's actions as a legitimate exercise in its right to self-defense. So again, just wanted to highlight that double standard. Syria, the new Syrian transitional government, which the U.S. State Department and the U.S. media is propping up as this hopeful, like, yes, authoritarianism is gone, but Israel has the right to defend itself, but Syria no longer does perform effectively because they don't have the capacity to do it. And so what are the strategic goals for Israel in the region? Well, of course, it's obvious, all aimed at securing its dominance and neutralizing potential threats. And one of its primary goals was, again, the elimination of any remaining Syrian military forces, in preventing Hezbollah from acquiring advanced weapons via Syrian territory. And it looks pretty bleak, but again, I want to emphasize that just because this corridor is shut off and Syria will, unfortunately, it looks like it's going to continue experiencing massive hardships for a while, it doesn't mean like these organizations are going to just die. Hezbollah is not going to go away or disappear, and neither is Palestine. But what I wanted to get to this is now a lot of people were saying like liberation for Syria now, Palestine next. I don't, as things stand right now, unless something drastic happens, I don't see how that was going to work, because again, it was always going to be Israel would have to be pressured to stop military action. And then a postmortem with what happened in Gaza would happen. They'd finally have to let in journalists. It'd be isolated. They'd be pariah statified. It's not even really a word. The illegal settlements in West Bank would hopefully stop. The framework for a process of two-state solution would go into effect. It would fail, and then it would eventually, over years and years, have to become a one-state. I don't know how that happens now. Donald Trump's about to get into office now. His entire cabinet is stacked with hardened Zionists, and because Israel has, its fortunes have taken a complete 180. Now northern Gaza is going to be settled. There will be no more Palestinians in there after they finally are able to basically cut off supplies, maybe find the last few remaining tunnels, and then absolutely cleanse the entire thing. And then they will begin a campaign of forced migration. And Donald Trump will force other countries to take voluntary migrants and put them out. Now we're seeing both posters in the West Bank saying like there is no future for you in Palestine, like massive billboards over there. And so while I get the elation, and while I can't imagine how happy and excited some people are that Assad is gone, that is another reality that we're looking at, unless things change drastically like they have 2 weeks ago.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is the thing. The liberation of the Syrian people is intrinsically tied to the liberation of the Palestinian people and the people of Lebanon and the entire region and the world, for that matter. We're all connected. And the Syrian people have wanted drastic reform, and Assad's establishment regime was fundamentally problematic in many, many ways. I have a lot of criticisms of Assad personally. I think, I mean, one of the many aspects would be even the betrayal of any sort of socialist movement within the Arab realm, the betrayal of the Palestinian people in the 60s, the betrayal of Saleh Jadid, basically the corrective movement. I could go on and on and on. However, this is the thing. When you have the fact that there was a desire for change, and even in 2011, we did see like people taking the streets and looking for reform, which is a genuine movement, that is then instantly hijacked by operations that were fundamentally driven by like imperialists that spent trillions on training and arming particular thousands, actually tens of thousands of militant groups within your country that hijack your revolution, overthrow an establishment, but then in its place, what we're seeing are these different factions, all of which are Western backed. And by Western, I would also include Turkey. Sorry. Because when we're looking at the SNA, for example, the funding of, even I think they've even to a certain extent funded the FSA as well. NATO at the end of the day is Turkey's at the end of the day is a NATO country. when you have all these different players, Qatar included, and we also have all these intelligence memos and the WikiLeaks documents that have verified the fact that Qatar and Saudi Arabia were arming ISIS and all these extremists, and the US knew about it, and Jake Sullivan's emails to Hillary Clinton that said Al-Qaeda is on our side and they were collaborating with them in Syria. You have just stripped the Syrian people of their ability to genuine rebellion that would have brought about a revolution that would have favored the Syrian people. So when we're talking about liberation, what sort of liberation? We've gone from a secular state to now, like I said, looking at sort of Sharia law and morality police taking over. We've seen declarations being made as to a liberalization of Syria's markets and oils, which means you can have all these oil company and giants come in and essentially appropriate Syria's oil. We're talking about pipelines being established within Turkey and Qatar, which was like one of the main, I think, what was something that actually triggered, in a way, all this foreign intervention in Syria to begin with. This essentially means a lot of the wealth that the Syrian people, that it belongs to the Syrian people, is most likely going to be siphoned out of Syria by all these major players and actors. Even the so-called revolutionaries are not even predominantly Syrian. So that compromises, I guess, the idea of like an authentic revolution that would have favored just the Syrian people alone. So the idea of liberation has now, in my opinion, for the Syrian people, in my opinion, of course, has gone further away, because where they've thrown Assad out of power, now you have a different form of oppression that's going to, in my opinion, take control over Syria. And that imperialist structure that's now being formed threatens the axis of resistance as a whole. And the axis of resistance was the only force basically pushing back against Western imperialism. And this is now going to be detrimental to the Palestinian movement, and it's also going to be detrimental to Lebanon. It's not saying that the axis is going to be destroyed, no, but it has been issued a major blow, a very significant blow. So as far as I see it, the liberation of Syrian people, like the true liberation of Syrian people, that is not in any way tinted by foreign investments and powers, has not happened. But what we've seen has been sort of the slow takeover by Western imperialism that is going to filter through into Palestine, into other parts of Western Asia. And this is now why we're also seeing conversations being had within, again, Israeli media. The fact that Syria's air defense systems have been destroyed, so its military infrastructure, is actually even paving the way now for probably a war with Iran. And under a Trump administration, well, they're prepping for this anyway. And what this means for the region as a whole will be complete subjugation. That's what I see, and therefore I don't see any liberation for anyone, whether it's the Syrian people, whether it's the Palestinian people, or even Iraq. And that's another conversation that never gets spoken about. I mean, Iraq, until today, is still essentially kind of occupied by the U.S. I mean, all its oil revenue is essentially taken by the U.S. It's placed by the Federal Reserve in a U.S. bank. By the Federal Reserve in the U.S., and it's only then sort of shipped back to Iraq. But all oil revenue instantly goes to the Federal Reserve in the United States, who have control over the entire oil industry, and often use that control of the oil industry of Iraq to essentially blackmail them whenever Iraq even so much as says, we would like the United States, for example, military to be removed from our territory. So this is a form of colonialism. This is a form of colonialism. This is how imperialism functions. So now we're seeing all these powers, Israel, Turkey, the U.S., which is Western imperialism as a whole, sort of taking complete control over the region. And we're going to see similar things, I think, take place in Syria, because unfortunately the revolution was very early on compromised. And I think that's going to manifest poorly in the region, or at least right now I don't really see, but I want to be proven wrong. How we come out of this.
Yeah, we have to recognize that there are plenty of hopeful Syrians out there, and I talked to like a Christian living in Syria a couple of days ago, and of course definitely worried about what that looks like under a new transitional government. But they're basically like Russia and Iran out first, America and Israel out next. And I hope it works. Maybe it will in years time. But Israel's actions, though, kind of in Syria, have far-reaching implications for West Asia. You know, like neighboring states as well, like particularly like Jordan and Egypt, are going to find themselves in increasingly precarious positions. The rise of these extremist movements aligned with Ankara, coupled with, I guess, like Israel's expanding influence, has left these kind of like normalizer nations grappling with security concerns and diminished regional clout. So at the times, like this is Israel's moves have deepened divisions within the Arab world, and normalization efforts with Israel by certain Arab states have further fractured alliances, leaving this entire region now disunited in its response to the Syrian crisis. Like what's going on within like the pro-Palestine activism movement is a microcosm for what's happening in the wider region. So I think the greatest casualties of this reshuffling, I guess we could call them, are the Arab people themselves.
The Syrian people, the Arab people, they're the ones
Yeah.
that are going to suffer the brunt of everything. This is the reality of the situation.
Yeah, and so
yeah.
and you brought up Lebanon, the internecine fighting that they hope to inspire there between Shia, Sunni, Maronite Christians, the different armed factions. They're going to try to chaosify. Again, I'm not using real words this episode. The entire region. And you brought up Iran. Iran's next. I was talking to a 4-star general. I'm going to have him on again. He's a disgruntled 4-star general who was basically in charge of military readiness of the Army Reserves and National Guard for years and decades. And he's basically like, it looks like they're really putting in the prerequisites, putting in the necessary levers to reinstitute the draft. And there's definitely a big neocon and actually now neolib push to actually deal with Iran once and for all. And so and then A24, this independent new movie studio who's got a lot of clout for making these like really artsy good horror movies, is now making a legitimate Iraq War circa 2006 Black Hawk Down spinoff military propaganda. And guess who watches A24 movies? Gen Z. They love A24. So all these levers are being put in place. And under the Trump administration, it's concerning what will happen with Iran. But that was just a little tangent. You sent that I just wanted to recognize that in the imperial core, you're gonna be affected by this as well, big time.
Yeah, just like a small point on Iran, people have to understand that how important Iran has always been to the West. I mean, this is why they orchestrated coup after coup in 1954, etc. What they inserted the Shah. Iran was one of the pillars for Western imperialism in the Middle East. It's a country that's incredibly rich in resources, but also geostrategically located by the Strait of Hormuz, etc. I mean, its trade routes and its significance in terms of economic trade around the world is vital. When you control Iran's oil resources and also its geostrategic location, you are able to better control the world economy, and therefore you hegemonize the world under your leadership. This is essentially what imperialism is, and we've discussed before how imperialism functions. It's meant to, imperialism, it requires complete subordination and monopoly of capital and power. So take this war that they're trying to prepare for Iran it will really cement Western imperialism and hegemony for a good while. I mean, and this is what people need to understand. When that happens, that's a threat to pretty much everybody. And then, at one point, you mentioned sort of kicking Iran out of Syria, etc. This is the thing. It's not, Iran wasn't controlling Syria. Assad was an opportunist that sort of collaborated with those that gave him a degree of, like I said, that it could safeguard him, so to speak. But this is the one important difference. Russia and Iran, China, Syria, etc., all these nations, they're not even ideologically aligned. These are different. These are all very ideologically different states. they ally with one another. This is the thing, because the fall of one will instantly mean the fall of the other. This is what I think there's a big distortion of, and we're seeing that play out now. The fall of Syria will automatically lead to, like, it's going to basically now isolate Iran. When you've isolated Iran, you're going to be destroying the entirety of the axis, but then also Western Asia will fall firmly into the hands of Western imperialism, and how that's going to manifest in geopolitical and economic terms is going to be detrimental. I mean, that was also the core for the BRI, the Silk Road, and sort of the alternative.
For the listeners who aren't familiar and you're just getting into this, that's China's Belt and Road Initiative, a transnational logistical network that would potentially enrich every country, and obviously with China as the first among equals. It's brick stuff, and you brought up these inherent contradictions between Iran, China, Russia, inherently not ideologically similar at all. And we can see that in BRICS as well. Like BRICS literally has India and China as part of the same organization,
and
which is
have their
wild.
own, exactly.
So it's more like for survival purposes.
Exactly. This is what I'm trying to say. It's more for eliminating hegemony and providing a world of multipolarity that in of itself could provide for more autonomy for states gradually moving forward. Like, this is sort of the agenda, non-interventionist approach. Everybody sort of sticks to themselves, and internationalism, which is different to globalization and imperialism. This is essentially what the premise is. And right now, with the huge destructions of massive sabotage of the BRI that's happened with Syria, and moving forward as to their plans for Iran, which it looks like this is what essentially they're going towards. This is going to isolate Iran. It's going to significantly impact the BRI, and eventually you've got Russia also having its own war breaking out. I mean, if the West is successful in bringing down Russia and Iran, I mean, China will then follow, and that will be within the next few years afterwards. This is what I'm saying. It's not just what's happening in Syria isn't just isolated to Syria. Unfortunately, it's part of a greater project and of the survival of imperialism, and ultimately imperialism is contingent to, its existence is contingent to subordination. So if we really want liberation, we really need to issue blows to imperialism as a whole so that people can truly achieve that form of liberation. But yeah, that's what I want to say with regards to Iran and its significance. But yeah, I think you were gonna play a video before I went on my little tangent.
Right, and so these entire systems of imperialism, U.S. involvement in other countries are infinitely complex. So, like in the military, because of the politics and the challenges inherent on the ground and their scope within international politics are so complex, you have to compartmentalize when you're trying to conceptualize operations. So there's like the tactical level, which is basically boots on the ground, and that's more like actual like fighting stuff, right? And of course, on the tactical level, there's also like human intelligence collection operations and stuff, but it's all centered within a certain battle space. And then you have what's happening on and so tactical operations, when you're taking into consideration those, you have like local sources and informants and targets and stuff like that. But on the operational level, that's the entire theater. So that's like Iraq. Like, what are the overall operations in Iraq? And then the strategic level is basically like what's happening in Iraq and Afghanistan and with Russia and all these things. So basically, you only conceptualize that because the human brain only has so much. Like it, you can only do so much. So you can only focus on like one aspect. So we were talking about the geostrategic reshuffling of everything because of Syria, talking about consequences for Iran, BRICS. We can't get into all these things in a single episode. And maybe going forward, we should focus on like one of the three strata of conceptualization. I think I just realized talking about Syria, because literally the entire global order, or how we thought it was going to play out, has been completely reshuffled, mostly with Asia, with West Asia. So I think coming back to Syria, the bottom line is like, I don't know. I've just congratulated so many people that Assad is gone, but we just have to recognize that this other reality is that the United States is very happy about it. And that's usually not good for people in the global south. So here is a video that Alina found. Sorry, the video file's kind of like fragmented, but the
Sorry
audio
about
is
that.
still
That's on
there.
my that was my bad. For some reason, I don't know why when I downloaded it, it was like that, but I was like, it's fine. At least the subtitles are there.
What year is this from?
I think it says it on. I think
it's 2019. Yeah, so this was at a talk done at CSIS, the Combined Center for Strategic and International Studies. It's one of the preeminent military-oriented think tanks. So this is about this is just contextualizing Western intent, United States intent in Syria.
Still had compelling forms of leverage on the table to shape an outcome that was more conducive and protective of U.S. interests. And we identified 4. So the first one was the 1/3 of Syrian territory that was owned via the U.S. military with its local partner, the Syrian Democratic Forces. Now, this was a light footprint on the U.S. military, only about 1,000 troops over the course of the Syria Study Group's report, and then the tens of thousands of forces, both Kurdish and Arab, under the Syrian Democratic Forces. And that 1/3 of Syria is the resource-rich, it's the economic powerhouse of Syria. So where the hydrocarbons are, which obviously is very much in the public debate here in Washington these days, as well as the agricultural powerhouse. But we argued that it wasn't just about this 1/3 of Syrian territory that the U.S. military and our military presence owned, both to fight ISIS and also as leverage for affecting the overall political process for the broader Syrian conflict. There were 3 other areas of leverage. One is political and diplomatic isolation of the Assad regime. This is, in our assessment, one of Russia's goals in the Middle East, is the propaganda win for Russia of rehabilitating Assad on the international stage, of basically forcing the international community to normalize him and welcome him back in without any behavioral changes. So holding the line on diplomatic isolation, preventing embassies from going back into Damascus. 2 is the economic sanctions architecture. So some of this is part of the maximum pressure campaign of the Trump administration on Iran, but there's a whole suite of both executive and congressional sanctions on Syria and Bashar al-Assad, both for human rights abuses in Syria and to the backers of Assad for their activities in support of him in Syria. And 3 was reconstruction aid. So the United States remains the overall largest single donor of humanitarian aid to Syrians both inside Syria and refugees outside of Syria. And there was some stabilization assistance in the part of Syria that was liberated from ISIS and controlled via the Syrian Democratic Forces in northern eastern Syria. The rest of Syria, though, is rubble. And what the Russians want and what Assad wants is economic reconstruction. And that is something that the United States can basically hold a card on via the international financial institutions and our cooperation with the Europeans. So we argued that absent behavioral changes by the Assad regime, we should hold the line on preventing reconstruction aid and technical expertise from going back into Syria.
Well, yeah.
So this is what I'm speaking about. This is why, I know. This is what I'm speaking of. They have spent 14 years, arming militants, but not just that. They're sitting openly talking about this is the U.S. interest. That's how she starts off. U.S. interest is behavioral change, which also began, this discussion with regard to behavioral change actually initiated back in 2010 when Bashar al-Assad had rejected the Qatar, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, whatever pipelines into the EU that would have cut off Iran and Russia, which is obviously 2 other targets, going back to our previous conversation. And he basically turned that pipeline down and then actually agreed towards the Syria, Iraq, Iran pipeline, which actually would have been far more fruitful in the context of BRICS and Iran and Russia. So he had already strategically aligned himself in a different position that countered Western interests. And then from that point on, U.S. interests openly started discussing. We have reports from 2010 about the need for behavioral changes or else. And so here we are with open declarations of the CSIS. And what she's essentially stating in it here is the use of sanctions to economically cripple the country which is, collective punishment. I mean, it is collective punishment on the Syrian public because they're the ones that are going to suffer the cost, so that the Assad regime can't actually even offer to his people, even if he wanted to at this point. In conjunction, obviously, with this warfare that's breaking out with the rebels, these so-called rebels that then turn into ISIS, etc., over the years. And then even when it comes to, then political isolation, which prevents Syria from acting normally as a state, and therefore, again, diminishing its ability to function even international trade and engage in economic relations, which is in conjunction and complements, obviously, the sanctions themselves. And even when it comes to aid, because obviously, humanitarian aid, the United States provides the most in terms of humanitarian aid. They wouldn't provide Syria, like the territories of, that were occupied, they were under the control of the SAA. They were not entitled to even any sort of reconstruction aid to allow for the country to rebuild itself. So she said, we're keeping the country in rubble, quite literally. And then the final thing that she also pointed out is that they also occupied the parts of Syria, which we said this before, like a third of it was occupied by the US, and obviously the SDF forces are backed by the US. They made sure to occupy all the territories that were resource and wealth rich, so that the Assad sort of state wouldn't be able to actually use resources to even trade or sell or have an income. Therefore, sponging and creating such a hollow economy was just going to collapse on itself. And so this has also played a role as to what happened with the Syrian army. To be honest with you, most of them weren't even getting funding. The entire state was at the brinks of collapse, and that's exactly what they wanted. And you have a U.S. official here stating these are the U.S. interests, and this is what we're doing to bring about an end to essentially Assad. This is, by all intents and purposes, it is very, externally influenced regime change, and it's unfortunate because there was a desire by the Syrian people for change, but not like this. And I feel like the Syrian people have been stripped away of their dignity in this, because now, yes, they're happy, but what is going to follow is very, very concerning, and it's sad, in my opinion. But this is basically what the U.S. has been doing to Syria for the past 14 years.
So that's a really good point about the aid. The reason the U.S. gives out the most aid is because it's a carrot and a stick. Like, it can be withheld and weaponized as well for political and diplomatic concessions. Also, the terrorist designation. So they are dangling the terrorist designation, whether or not they're going to remove it from the new transitional HTS government or not. That's another diplomatic lever that they're using. So it's kind of like, even if we're going to believe the CNN narrative that Jelani's completely reformed, he's now a revolutionary, like Che Guevara, which obviously not, but even okay, I know
that's an insult to Che. Like, I feel offended.
I know. Even if we're supposed to believe all this BS, there's really nothing you can do. There's the sanctions lever. There's the humanitarian aid lever. There's the terrorist organization lever. You have Israel invading. You have that lever. The U.S. won't stop it, but they could for diplomatic concession as well. It's like, what do you do as a politician, as a government, even if you had the best interests for your people in mind? Like, what do you actually do?
This is what I'm trying to say. Syria has now completely fallen. This is incredibly sad. And I it's not. I do want to be, honestly, I do want to be proven wrong. I want to see hope, because it's not just hope for the Syrian people, we hope for the entire region. But it's very difficult. And the thing is as well, because the US was basically hoarding all the wealth of Syria for the past 14 years, a lot of this also went to these rebel groups. Like, they were the ones that were receiving the financial gains from that as well, which is another reason why I believe a lot of them are, they are compromised. And I feel like that's why we're seeing the sort of ease by which they're not really taking a firm stance against Israel and against what Israel's doing to Syria, and even against Turkey, because as well, I mean, Erdogan came out just a few days ago and made a speech about correcting World War One errors, aka the fragmentation of
we should
empire.
do a whole episode on this neo-Ottomanism. Like,
oh yeah, that's a, I mean, he said the same thing about Cyprus as well. Cyprus is technically Turkish, and I mean, he constantly threatens Cyprus as well with, we just might take the rest of the island if you push your buttons. It's just something that Erdogan likes to do. But yeah, this neo-Ottoman aspect of Erdogan, it's been prevalent for a rather long time. And I think that was also why, because actually Erdogan and Assad were very close friends before 2011. And it was interesting that at that time, when the Arab Spring had begun, and then you started seeing all these rebel groups coming in, Turkey had actually said they wouldn't support the rebel groups if they allow for members of the Muslim Brotherhood to become like prominent members of a reformed state in Syria, which Assad turned down, and obviously relations then soured. So, I mean, you can see how, every actor here has something to gain out of Syria, and the Syrian people, I feel, will lose. At least the way I currently see things, and it's not just going to be that. That's going to trickle down into Palestine, Lebanon, Iran, Iraq, and then BRICS, the BRI.
It's a complete reshuffling of the dynamics that existed before the ceasefire in Lebanon. Also, I can't show it because I haven't been allowed to by who gave it to me, but there was an email sent out by the Naval Readiness Center to create a new initiative to prepare for a conflict in the Pacific over the Strait of Taiwan in 2027. So that's fun too. And this whole thing has solved America's problems about getting bogged down in an uncontrollable situation in West Asia, because now it's well in hand. And that was important for the geostrategic shift to East Asia. And so, yeah, that's the new reality we're with. But as you can see, hope springs eternal, because literally the entire global the entire dynamic shifted in 2 weeks, and hopefully it can again in unforeseen ways. So here's to hoping for that. But again, no one knows what it looks like.
Look, I also do want to, I don't want to end things on a bad note from my part, in the sense of, at the end of the day, wherever there is, as long as imperialism is basic economic sort of analysis, is doomed to collapse, because its system, its structure cannot survive. Like, its material conditions will always deteriorate. And as long as that exists, there will always be resistance. That's just the order of the way like even science works, the way the world works. I guess what's disappointing, I would say, is just I feel like this was a massive blow to the overall anti-imperialist struggle, and at least it set us back, I feel. But it doesn't mean that all hope is gone. What that means for the Syrian people right now, we're going to see going forward. I believe that, unfortunately, the Syrian civil unrest will continue because of all these different factions that are going to be combating for territory, etc. We're going to see how that's going to escalate and how not. And the liberalization of Syria's market to foreign corporations, I think, will be detrimental to the Syrian people. But then, the Palestine issue, I think, is really going to take a massive hit. How this is going to affect Hezbollah? Hezbollah isn't weak. However, it has been
severely degraded. Yeah.
Yes. And that is concerning, given the fact that we've said multiple times. I've said on my social media, I think I've said it even on this channel, that Israel cannot defeat Hezbollah. It was too powerful. But the way by which they'll do it is internal civil strife and making statements along the line of HTS in Lebanon. Like, this is kind of what they've alluded to. That this is what Israel stated. I'm not saying it's a matter of, when they're making these statements, and we know for that we know that there has been a connection between these two parties. It does concern me as to the kind of conditions that they're going to try and create in Lebanon to try to press and suppress the resistance. And I'm hopeful that won't be successful. But Hezbollah has taken a hit, and that's just something I feel needs to be addressed, just so we can have a more realistic, in my personal opinion, view of what's going on, so we can calculate better going forward.
Yeah, and also I will say one silver lining or hopeful aspect of this is the deteriorating material conditions in the imperial core. People
Yes,
can't
that's true.
afford rent. Luigi Mangione just shot the United Healthcare CEO, and the ruling class is shook. If you saw Peter Thiel on Piers Morgan, and people are like celebrating it in a way that
Mhm.
no one thought was possible. And now, what's going to happen over the Trump presidency when tariffs come into effect? Grocery prices go up, everything gets harder. When a possible recession hits in a couple years, like 18 months, that's a lot of economists are talking about that,
These are
including
fantastic points.
um,
Fantastic
and
points.
then what else? Oh yeah, more money for wars, more money for Israel, reinstituting the draft. Like imperialism can't survive without the tacit complacency of the citizens in the core of empire. So that's just
Great.
something to look forward going over. So, things getting worse for us would make things better for people in the global south. Just saying. So we'll be looking for that.
I think you brought up some really great points at the end. I mean, to sustain these wars and these operations that they're planning against Iran, trying to control the situation in Western Asia, which is chaotic. Yes, it's in their interest right now, but it is chaotic, and they're going to have to try to manage it somehow. And then obviously Russia, and then the impending project for China. This is going to cost a lot of money, and it's going to come out and it's going to impact the real material conditions of the working class in the US, who are already agitated, and that's going to significantly worsen. So we're going to be seeing movements throughout the Western world coming from grassroots movements from the working class, and this is going to be a positive, because ultimately I think everybody in Switzerland, we're all like, a struggle against imperialism is an international movement. The international working class everywhere has to be united, and this is another aspect. We need to stop being fragmented. And understand that the liberation of one people is the liberation of all peoples. And so, what's happening in the US and what will happen to the economic conditions in the US will bring about a type of conversation. And the Luigi case is, he's been quite the hero in the US. And this is just the start, I think. It does show a social shift within the sort of public of the US, or the public conversation in the US.
And it's not, I'll end on this. I lived in Athens for a minute, and a couple of my Greek friends were saying like it was dominating the news cycle for like an entire week, that one story. And of course,
Mm-hmm.
the Greek people have their own grievances against corrupt government officials and business magnates as well. So we might see a chain reaction here in an unprecedented way that no one foresaw, just like this reversal of fortune for the axis of resistance over the past 2 weeks. So anyways, y'all, we are out of time, so we'll be here. We're not going anywhere. We're almost at the 1 year anniversary. So like, share, and subscribe if you feel like it. And we will be back tonight. Myself, Mark, and maybe someone else, to talk about these stupid drones over New Jersey that people keep mistaking. It's like, oh, you saw a helicopter for the first time. Must be a government, big business, hybrid alien project. Anyways, we're going to talk about it and maybe have some fun with it. All right. Anyways, thanks so much for watching, and we will see you later tonight. Bye-bye.